Tell me when
We're
we're
now
on.
live.
Tell me when we're on air.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'll head off straight to item 1, which is apologies for absence. I've received apologies from Councillor Tina Mackenzie Boyle. Has anyone received any others? I'll take that as a no. So we'll move on to item number 2, which is the election of a chairman. Can I have any nominations?
Tony Virgo.
That's Tony Virgo. Do we have a seconder?
I'll second that, Ray Mawson.
Thanks, Ray.
And any others? I'll take that as no. So Tony Virgo is elected as chairman. I'll hand over to you, Tony.
Thank you very much, Harry. That's it, Harry. We've got to elect a deputy. I would like to nominate, please, Tina Mackenzie Boyle. And I'm just looking for a seconder, please.
I'll second it, Dorothy.
Thank you, Dorothy. So welcome everyone to the climate change panel. We have a couple of items to talk about. One, we have some guests from Countryside who are going to enlighten us with the latest climate change initiatives, which I know they will be on the ball about. They better be, anyway. I'm sure they will be. And after that, we have the strategy, and I hope people have read the strategy rather thoroughly and will come up with some good thoughts, because I've got some, and I'm sure others have too. So, without more ado, let me just introduce two people from Countryside. I'm not sure who's going to go first. Percy, welcome.
Can we, Councillor Virgo?
Yes.
I'll be taking the minutes of the last meeting.
Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't do that, did I?
So, you know, before that's item 5.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I just leapt ahead because I saw people there. So going back to the agenda, has anyone got any notes on the minutes? That's pages 1 to 4.
It's Councillor Hazier, no problem with the minutes, apart from the fact, very kindly, Hannah Harding sent out on the 10th of May, a listing of the Rangers.
Right.
I did ask, could we not send this, and I do think it's appropriate, we send this out to all councillors, so that it's not just ourselves.
Yeah.
Are aware of this. If you don't mind, I was going to say, could we get this out there, please?
Yeah, let's do that. Do you want me to do that? Do you want me to make sure that happens?
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'll do that. Has anyone else got any other points to raise? Okay. And the other thing I didn't ask is a declaration of interest, of course. Has anyone got a declaration of interest? And I take from the silence that they don't. So, going back to where we were. So Robert and Percy. Percy, I don't know who wants to go first, but welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Councillor Virgo. I'll take the lead on this just to start off with. So, yeah, apologies, my full name's not on the screen there, but my name's Percy Mullally. I'm Development Director for Countryside, West London, Thames Valley. My role is, in terms of the relationship with Bracknell Forest councillors, I'm one of the key personnel on the Bracknell Forest Cambium joint venture between Countryside and the council. I'm joined by Robert McDermott, who is he is the Countryside Group Director for Sustainability. So my specific role is in relation to the sort of smaller part of the business. Robert has a much wider reach across the entire of the Countryside organisation. And so the plan is Robert will take us through a presentation that sets out Countryside's approach to sustainability and how we're going to tackle some of the emerging issues that there are in relation to net zero carbon and other wider sustainability issues. And I should really start off by saying we really do appreciate the opportunity this evening to present this to you. And it's really great to see so many of you in attendance, and hopefully we can give you a really good overview about how Countryside are tackling this incredibly important issue. I think we're all very aware that it is an increasingly difficult proposition to overcome, and that construction has a massive role to play in trying to address this issue. And, you know, as part of the joint venture with the council, we have various strategies across the sites that we're taking through and we'll be delivering. But what we'll do is, if people have got specific questions about either the strategy or anything else, please just fire them through, or we can address them at the end of the presentation. But I appreciate we've only got about 20 minutes, so I'll pass straight over to Robert, who can take us through the presentation.
Hello, good evening, everybody. If you just bear with me, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Hopefully this should work.
Yeah, we can see that, Rob.
I'll just try and put it in presentation mode so it appears a bit bigger on your screen. Is that?
Yeah, that's great. Right.
Superb. Right. Okay. Well, we've got this 20-minute window, so I won't hang about. It'd probably be worthwhile just introducing myself. I know Percy introduced me in terms of the context of my role at Countryside, but just a little bit of background on myself. I've been practicing sustainability now for over 2 decades, in fact. And prior to joining Countryside, I led on sustainability at the Cabinet Office. So fairly well versed in all matters sustainability. Okay, so what I want to cover here, and apologies, I will have to move through this at pace. So please, if you do have any questions, perhaps maybe better at the end, so I don't go over my 20-minute window really. What I'll do is I'll look at Countryside sustainability strategy and break that into the 3 pillars as I described there. Well, then obviously delve into a bit more detail around carbon net zero. And I think it's worthwhile in doing so is to explore some of the kind of definitions around it and have a kind of a common sense of understanding, which I think isn't always the case around this aspect really. And then of course look specifically at what Countryside is going to do to achieve net zero by 2030. Okay, so Countryside has set out a sustainability approach which fundamentally underpins our purpose to create places where people love to live with sustainable communities built to last. And from that, as you can see, we've then configured 3 pillars that sit underneath that: built to last, sustainable communities, and thriving together. And for each of those 3 pillars, excuse me, we then set out 3 high-level outcomes that we're looking to achieve around homes and quality of life and helping our own people in our business work in a kind of a thriving workplace, really. Moving on from that and just delving into a little bit more detail specifically around those pillars, starting with built to last. So we have, as an organisation, set science-based carbon targets, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But also, of course, looking more broadly at sustainability, we've set targets around improving our safety performance, procurement of sustainable timber, a real strong commitment to modern methods of construction and building homes through our factories. We've set targets around reducing the waste of the construction processes, as you can see there, to 20%, but also targets around customer satisfaction and improving water efficiency. Looking at sustainable communities as our second pillar, there's a real mix of social, economic and environmental targets here, ranging from the provision of affordable homes, the generation of social value, a commitment to enhancing the environment and nature through tree planting and biodiversity net gain, but also work we're doing around job creation plans, supporting the supply chain. And the final one there is a commitment on our behalf to undertake 3 post-occupancy studies a year. So for all these developments that we finish and complete, we'll revisit them and undertake some quite detailed study to see if we achieve the kind of outcomes that we set out onto from the onset. And the final pillar of our sustainability approach is around thriving together, if you like, a little bit more internally focused, but looks how we can be as a kind of responsible organisation, looking at equality and diversity, the payment of a fair wage to the Living Wage Foundation, but also looking and addressing issues around mental health first aid on our construction site, which is one of the kind of the problems in industry. Okay, so what I want to do now really is set out this kind of a common understanding and definition around carbon net zero. So I think the best way to look at this really, keeping it at high level at the moment, is 2 fairly simple concepts of what you can see here of power down and power up. So in the case of power down, what we have to do as a society, of course, is reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, and at the same time power up our production of renewable energy. And the point being, if we can do that at the rate that this graph suggests, by around 2050, they should meet and put us in a position around net zero. Now, the term net zero is important here because that still acknowledges that even by 2050, there will still be some carbon emissions being generated by the UK. There's going to be some really hard to decarbonise sectors of industry, which will not necessarily be tackled by that point in time. But the idea of netting off, of course, is that by 2050, because we've powered up and powered down, that actually the amount of carbon we emit will be captured by natural means in the atmosphere. Okay, so moving on from that, and perhaps the best way to describe this is through achieving a balance. So in this case, as you can see visually, this idea of carbon balancing off with it being naturally captured. So okay, so if you explore that a little bit further, and we talk about the net zero home, and the principle of achieving this balance remains really, but this time the balance comes from ensuring that all the heat and power needs of the home are met entirely by renewable energy. So when this is the case, the home can be considered as net zero. But what the Future Home Standard and the building regulations are directing us to do is not necessarily build a zero carbon home in perfect balance in terms of its final construction, but rather acknowledge that actually the power needs of the home won't entirely be met by renewable energy in this decade from 2022 now as we are to 2030. But as the grid starts to decarbonise, any power that it does require will, for a period of time, then put it into a position where it is in balance and is then net zero. So this is why you'll hear the term zero carbon ready homes, because it's just acknowledging that actually there's more work in terms of grid decarbonisation to be done until it can be considered as truly net zero. Okay, if you like, now focusing a little bit more on Countryside, we've set out a pathway to achieve net zero by 2030, if you like, our framework for change based on these headings of direction, delivery and determination, about setting out a clear vision with some really strong science-based targets, then being clear in terms of how we're going to deliver on those targets through a pathway. But I guess importantly as well, ensuring that there's real strong accountability and responsibility in our organisation for achieving what we set out to do. I think hopefully you'll find this quite an informative graphic. There's a lot going on here, so I will try to explain it in a little bit more detail. For any organisation that is looking to set science-based targets, what you have to do is understand the whole value chain of your carbon emissions. So that's looking at the emissions which are generated from the extraction of raw materials, of course, the processing of those materials, then the construction of the homes using those materials, all the way through to the homes then being lived in for 60 years plus, and of course, their final demolition, hopefully a long, long time from now. So what you have to do as an organisation to set science-based targets is understand where your emissions sit across that full value chain. And what you can see here, and that, if you like, is dictated by these percentage figures down at the bottom. And it's once you start to understand that, you then start to change your approach to becoming net zero as a business. And what I mean by that is predominantly organisations like ourselves have focused on reducing the carbon emissions related to our construction operations. So, for example, the fuel we use on site or the energy we may use to power our cabins or power our offices. But actually, when you look at your emissions across a full value chain, that only represents 2%. If you see, by far the greater proportion sits in the homes, that's 72% of people, of course, living in those homes for 60 years, sorry. But also, of course, in what is commonly described as embodied carbon. So that's the 18% and the 5% in the materials and the delivery of those materials to our site. So through understanding this emissions across your full value chain, you start to change your approach, and understandably looking at this, you're saying, well, we obviously need to concentrate more on the 18%, the 5% and the 72% as opposed to the 2% really. Okay, so again, there's a lot going on here, and again, I'll try to explain this. So what you can see here is a graph which maps out Countryside's carbon emissions from our baseline year of 2020 all the way through to 2030. And the three main blocks of colours, so we've got the kind of the two green colours and a purple colour, they're the emissions that are forecasted for Countryside to create over that, if you like, that decade. And the three main ones, which relate back to the slide we've just seen, relate to construction materials and the transportation of those materials, but also regulated energy. So that's the home in use for 60 years. So what you can see with this graph, you can see these emissions start to drop off. And as with any entity looking to set a kind of reduction trajectory, what needs to happen, there needs to be key interventions. So those interventions in this case are identified by the numbers 1, 2, and 3. So the first intervention around 2022 is to change the building regulations to the interim future home standard. You can see immediately the impact that has on our emissions. The second one, of course, is the future home standard coming in 2025, where gas boilers will no longer be fitted, which is, of course, a real marked drop off in our emissions. And the third one is, and this relates to the construction materials and transportation materials, because we have an organisation that's committed to build half of our homes by timber frame. Well, a timber frame home has 30% less embodied carbon than a traditional brick and block home. So because we've made that commitment, that's reflected in our emissions profile all the way through to the end of this decade, as if you like, as being that third key intervention. Just for completeness, in terms of this illustration here, the black dotted line is the science-based targets that we've set, as you can see there. And the green line, which is perhaps a little bit faint, but sits above the broader yellow line, that's, if you like, us delivering upon our internal targets. So, okay, so then moving on from that, and looking perhaps a little bit more specifically at what a home will look like when you build it to the new regulations. So this first illustration demonstrates what an interim future home standard would look like in terms of the features and characteristics of it. And in this case, you're looking at a home that's going to have 30% less CO2 emissions than previous building regulations. And I guess that the main constituent parts of that home are an improved fabric efficiency through thicker walls. You're also going to be looking at the likes of flue gas heat recovery, of course, solar panels, and increased air tightness, and perhaps some other smaller features to support. I'll move on to the next illustration. So the next illustration is what the future home standard in 2025 will look like in terms of the different technologies that will be fitted. I suppose the immediate and obvious change here being that, of course, we no longer have a gas boiler to heat that home. It's now being heated by a heat pump. Again, improved levels of fabric efficiency, but also an increased air tightness. And because you're making these homes more fabric efficient and more airtight, you then need to start to what's called mechanically move the air around. So that's potentially through centralized mechanical heat ventilation recovery, which is the illustration there in the loft. And of course, what you're also likely to be fitting is triple glazing into these homes. Okay, I think it's worthwhile just for a moment reflecting on what will the challenges be of building these homes at scale, if you like, these future homes. So I think the obvious one, of course, it's going to come with a sizable increase in build costs, estimated anywhere between 10 and 20,000 at the moment. You'd expect those costs to come down in terms of economies of scale, but that's certainly what the modelling is suggesting at the moment. Suppliers, whilst we expect to have a reasonable supply, the likes of heat pumps, what isn't the case at the moment is contractors to fit them. There isn't enough contractors around in the UK at the moment to fit all of these heat pumps. Hence the reason the government has set this kind of trajectory to introduce this, the future home standard, the use of heat pumps a little bit later, so we can build up that supply chain base. Of course, you're looking at a home that's fully electrified, and therefore there will be increased pressures on the local infrastructure to whether or not they can meet that additional demand, not only, of course, of electrified heating through the heat pumps, but of course a greater proliferation of EV charging and vehicles. But also, and one, I guess what we don't know at the moment is how well these will be received by customers who've perhaps become used to the technologies of gas-powered heating and how quickly you can heat your home up through gas-powered, whilst heat pumps won't quite work in that way. They're perhaps a little bit slower and a bit more of a comfort heating, so there'll be some work to do around like bringing customers along on that journey. A term you may or may not have heard of is this idea of a just transition to net zero. So there's a view that the current means by which we'll be looking to achieve net zero as a society could adversely affect the less well-off, particularly if you start to introduce carbon taxation. So what we're looking to achieve in a just transition to zero is to make sure it's fair and equitable, that movement towards a low-carbon society. And to do that, what we're looking to do and what others will need to look to do is try and minimise life cycle and heating costs for tenants and homeowners, support low-carbon initiatives in communities, support local economies, where we can share our knowledge and expertise, particularly with small to medium construction enterprises that perhaps don't have the resources that we do. And this is the final slide. I guess it's just reinforcing this message for us as an organisation that this stuff won't happen by accident. We need to remain committed, and one of the means that we do that is to incorporate the transition to net zero, the different, if you like, forums and governance bodies that we have in our organisation in terms of the different committees, but also maintain a really strong link to the HBF, which is the industry body around looking to support the movement towards the future homes and our work with the task force. Okay, that is that last slide. I suppose what just before we finish up and go for questions, really, I think it's important to acknowledge, as no doubt this audience does, is that I think moving towards a low carbon society is likely to be the greatest challenge of our lifetime, without question, really. And it can be easy to think, given the scale of that challenge, how can we make a difference, we as individuals or we as a company, really. But I think that perhaps the most important point to make is that we can and should and absolutely need to, really, is work together collectively to find these right solutions. Because just from a personal perspective, I don't think history will look favourably on us as a generation if we don't act now to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Okay.
Well done. Thank you very much, Robert. Can I start off with a couple of questions? I know we've got some people to ask them, but we've had in our climate change advisory panel, which has been going now for about 6 months or so, 6 or 7 months, and we had representation from Taylor Woodrow and another builder as well. And they were saying that the real problem with heat pumps is the manufacture of heat pumps. We just don't have enough manufacturing in this country to supply the heat pumps. So there's one question. The second question really is about heat pumps, Robert. There seems to be lots of variation about this. And to be absolutely honest, I hear good things and bad things about them. You've got to have obviously a well-insulated home, which I know that you've talked about, before they are going to be effective. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that and about people's worry that if you seal it all up, you're just causing another problem because we live in a very damp atmosphere here in the UK. And the very last question I'd just like to bang at you is water. Because I noticed Affinity Waters just sent something round saying that they are going to put a meter. I've got a meter actually, and I've had it for many years. And I'm sure a lot of other people have got meters, but people who haven't got meters, I'm absolutely surprised we haven't done this as mandatory. I mean, it's just ludicrous. And I wondered what you felt about grey water, because a lot of people feel that grey water is more trouble than it's worth. But I know in Germany, they have been successful in that. So, sorry, 3 questions.
Well, I counted 4.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so let's start with heat pumps and the manufacture of those heat pumps. I'm perhaps less concerned in terms of the manufacture of these heat pumps, because let's be quite pragmatic about this. There's obviously organisations that are keen to sell us these pumps around the world, from the Far East to Germany. And if there's a demand for their product, they'll just scale up. They'll put up another production line on track. So I don't think there's a lesser concern about the supply of them. The concern more rests with the idea of who can fit these pumps. So at the moment, there just is not enough contractors out there to fit these pumps, or the people who are at the moment, of course, fitting gas boilers haven't done the training of their qualifications to fit heat pumps. So that's probably the greater concern around heat pumps in terms of their insulation. But what we are starting to see now, and I guess this makes sense, doesn't it? So these heat pump manufacturers recognise that, you know, whilst they may be able to scale up production, somebody's got to fit them. So they're now starting to fund the training around the heat pump installation. So I do think we'll get there in the next 2 to 3 years around heat pumps. I'm not hugely concerned, but there is challenges. It's important to acknowledge. Heat pumps. Okay, so a modern heat pump works better when it's heating water to lower temperature than a gas boiler does. So therefore, you're going to have a higher level of thermal efficiency in that home for that heat pump to work effectively, which is essentially what he was alluding to. But, and it is a big but, and I guess this is more of a point relevant to the retrofit market as opposed to the new home market. So new homes will be built to the level of thermal efficiency for a heat pump to work effective. That's not going to be a problem. If you to put a heat pump in an old, say, 60s or 70s house with an EPC of an E or a D, it will not work. But what we're now seeing come onto the markets is heat pumps that can heat water to the temperatures not dissimilar to gas boilers. So you're starting to see those to come onto the market now. But of course, logic dictates that.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? Is that air heat pumps, or would that be ground pumps?
So that in the case of the heat pumps we're talking about, what you're probably predominantly going to see is air source heat pumps, and the reason being, of course, is that as you start to look at ground source heat pump or water source heat pumps, there's increased infrastructure costs, of course, of putting in the pipes in the ground or in the water. So an air source heat pumps work pretty effective. I apologize, I mean, I delve a little bit into the technology because it's important to understand this, is that what's driving government and many others to move towards heat pumps is what's called a coefficient of performance. So what a coefficient of performance is, it's the ability of an appliance to convert electricity to heat. So if you take an immersion heater, an example we're all familiar with, it has a coefficient of performance of 1 to 1. So for every 1 unit of electricity it uses, it returns 1 unit of heat, because that makes sense in a contained kind of space full of water. So where else is it going to go? And when you look at an electric boiler, which has been around for a good number of years, they have a coefficient of performance of not much greater than that. I think it's something like 1.1. So that's not the solution. But what you'll get with a heat pump, it has a coefficient of performance from anything ranging from 2 to 5. So meaning for every 1 unit of electricity that goes in, it's going to return 2 to 5 units of heat. So that's why they're looking at heat pumps as a solution, because they're how efficiently convert electricity to heat.
The noisy? No. Funny enough,
I mean, that's a complaint I've heard, but I've been along to a few of our sites now where we have fitted them, and no, super quiet. A lot less, interestingly, a lot quieter than the fans you get on gas boilers. I don't know if you stood out near a gas boiler flue and you can hear it whirring away. Yeah. It's quieter than that. So the noise thing isn't a problem, really.
Not on my Bosch, it isn't, I might add, but there you go.
Maybe you've got one of the older models. I suppose what I saw is one of the newer models, which I guess they've improved the technology. So if you like, that's the good and bad of heat pumps. It's about finding the right circumstances and the right pump for the right home. Sure. Air tightness, an interesting one. I get the point people are making is you start to restrict the flow of air in a house, which of course you'd need to do because drafts bring in cold and reduce efficiency and increase heating costs. And therefore, as I alluded to on the illustration, you've then got to find a way to mechanically move that air around the home as opposed to natural ventilation, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because what you can do, you can introduce means of doing that where you can actually start to capture excess heat. So you get what's called mechanical heat ventilation recovery, where you've got excess heat in kitchens and bathrooms. And actually, if you move that around in the right way, you can introduce clean air, but draw out the heat from those places and make sure that stays in the home. So again, perhaps not too much of a problem going forward. Grey water, I think, is going to be a challenge, because what you're looking at there is essentially capturing and keeping unclean water in your house, and all the problems that go along with that in terms of maintaining filters, but also you've got issues potentially around Legionellas. And whilst the technology is there and it's viable, our homeowner is going to want to be left in that situation where they're going to have to maintain water filters and the extra kind of costs, life cycle costs of maintaining that equipment, the feedback we're getting is perhaps not. I think it's more about looking to get the right water efficiency appliances in your home in terms of taps and showers and the likes of washing machines. That's probably the most sensible way to go in that regard, I think.
Okay, let's open this up. Thank you for that, Robert. Dorothy.
Yes, hello, Robert. We've actually been going just over a year, and Tony and I have the same thoughts on when it comes to heat pumps and the rest of it, because we had a gentleman come along and he put his own in, and the size of the heat pump was enormous. I mean, really enormous. And of course, when you're looking at this, yes, I can understand we don't have the water tank and the rest of it. Now, mine isn't so much the heat pump as that's for properties, houses. How do you see the heating of apartments? Because we do seem to have, like with yourselves, I know that I went to see some in Maidenhead you've been doing. How do you see the heating of that? And this other part that I would want to be questioned, and it's something I know that Tony and others would be thinking, when it comes to planning and placing one's planning applications in, my request would always be that the planning would have the EV charging. Even if you're not putting it in at that time, are you or have you put in your applications and such the requirement to be able to place EV in the design element of the settlements of the houses or whatever, just to be out there, because I do think this is something that should be regarded within planning.
Okay, I mean, what I'll do is I'll broadly pick up on, if you like, the three parts of that question around heat pumps, apartments and EV charging, and then Percy can kick in very specifically on EV charging provisions on developments in your area. Really. So in terms of, I mean, first of all, if the house is, say, above 2 to 3 bedrooms, it will need a water tank with a heat pump. The reason being, it can't heat water that quickly, really. If you've got a small, say, 2-bed, you won't need provisions for a water tank. But if you've got anything larger, 3 to 4 bed, it will need a water tank with that heat pump. And you're right, if you compare it to, say, a gas boiler, which you can hang on a wall, it's probably not dissimilar size to a kitchen cupboard. In fact, most, of course, are within kitchen cupboards. You are looking something more akin to kind of a fairly large fridge freezer, really. So there will be a requirement on house designers to accommodate that, but also when it's a larger house, accommodate that water tank. In terms of apartments, I mean, the same regulations apply to apartments as they do to low-rise housing, and we will need to be moving away from gas heating towards electrified heating or renewable heating. Predominantly doing that through a kind of an energy centre, which you then again use heat pump technology, except in this case, obviously on a much larger scale, piping water around to the apartment blocks with some provisions in individual apartments to top up the water temperature as it's moved from that heating, that energy centre through to the actual apartment itself. And just in terms of EV charging, well, the regulations that have come in, of course, this year will require the provision of EV charging infrastructure in the home. So that's, of course, getting the electricity and the fuse box set up for it, and if you like, a dummy plate. But obviously, that's for regulations that start from June onwards. Well, in June, about middle of June, you know, for potentially for building out later this year and into next year. So, I mean, that's a broad comment on those 3 areas. Personally, if you wanted to kick in specifically on EV charging.
I was going to pick up on the EV charging points. I think the interesting thing is that in the transition period that Robert just touched on, that in terms of the requirements for EV charging capability, that will change quite quickly from June 23 next year, where every home that's got an associated parking point in building regulations will be required to have an EV charging point made available to it. So already the whole regulatory environment behind is catching up really quickly. It does raise some questions, however, as to is the infrastructure there in the wider sense in terms of electricity capacity ready for this step change, and that's something that's going to be interesting. We don't have the answer to that, but the building regulations will require that all homes will have them that have got a parking space. In terms of the specific sites that the joint venture is delivering, we are aligned with Bracknell's current policy, which is it's actually quite far ahead of some other local authorities, where it will have 20% of all the parking spaces of the proposed schemes already live with live EV charging capability. In terms of the future-proofing element of that, around what can be added to it, that would very much depend on what infrastructure is available in the given scheme at a time. But that's something that can be explored once the schemes are delivered. But from day one, there'd be a 20% provision on the 2 sites that we're currently secured through planning. So hopefully that, Councillor Hayes, that deals with the questions, unless there was anything else.
Yes, it's excellent. It's nice to hear that we're ahead of the game, and something that I'm sure the other councillors would be pleased to hear as well. It's just, okay, one said about, if I may follow on Councillor Virgo before Councillor Lee comes in, just follow on this, because it is important that we get the structure right prior to the planning applications and yourselves bringing in such things. Under the infrastructure, have you done anything with anaerobic digester with regards to electricity into the grid on any of your sites in Britain that we could consider looking at?
I can happily answer that. No, I mean, it's unlikely you would get the generation of biomass from our kind of activities that would warrant anaerobic digestion being economically viable. I guess if we were an organisation that kind of produced byproducts at sufficient scale to warrant anaerobic digestion, like a large kind of factory facility, but I think it'd be viable. But at the moment, what we're not seeing is small-scale anaerobic digestion plants. They're a kind of medium to larger scale, and we just don't. There's nothing in terms of what we would do that generate the mass material for that digestion.
It's not directly related, Councillor Hayes, but there is a strategy that we're looking at on one of the sites in our region. We've recently secured planning for the Cambridge Road estate, which is in the Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames. One of the proposals that we're looking at, it's not in relation to electricity generation, but it's in relation to heat recovery from a neighbouring large-scale sewage works. So there's the proposal there in terms of district heating. It's fiendishly complicated, and we're not certain that it's going to work, but it's something that we are exploring with the local authority there to see if there's something that you can get the base level of district heating hot water into a system for the neighbouring scheme. But the scale of that, it's, you know, the development is about 2,500 homes, so it's a really quite it'll be the first of its kind if we can manage to get it to operate, but it's a very difficult one to bring forward, but one that might be worth keeping an eye on if it's of interest.
Yes, thank you very much. And last but not least, well, I know this is one of Tony's and mine both, is solar panel, because again, it's technology increasing itself. You know, it's not being the big ugly things you get on roofs, but are you at the technology being able to look at, and they should be put in on most designs of planning applications, that these be incorporated? What are your views on the solar panels?
I'll happily take that to start off with. So for both of the planning applications that the joint venture are looking at in Bracknell, at Cooper's Hill and Markin Street, they both incorporate PV panels, and part of that is the overall strategy to reduce carbon emissions on both sites. So the detail of exactly how and where they're placed is dealt with by condition, but both of them, there's a commitment to have quite significant provision of PV panels, and you're quite right in terms of how much they've improved in terms of efficiency. They have. I haven't got the full detail on that. It might be something that Robert can add any commentary to, but otherwise we are very much looking on that on all of the applications that we're considering at the moment. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Just a couple of things there. we just had a planning application, actually. I don't know if I should say that, but it was in the public domain, where we pressed so much for EVs, and in the end, the developer has put EVs on every single car park space provided. And I don't see, to be honest, why we can't do that, because it's just infrastructure. It's just sticking cables in the ground, isn't it, really? I'm sure someone will tell me it's not as easy as that. But, you know, so I would say that. The second thing is, one builder came along and said every house they put up now has solar cells on the roof. Every single house they build. And I think we'd like to see the same, please. Would you like to comment or not?
I think on the EV charging point, I think we on the sites that we've looked at, we've tried to balance what the scheme is trying to deliver overall in terms of the wider package of sustainability measures, local policy and everything else, and an affordable, compliant, affordable housing offer. So it's a really difficult balancing act. I think also the picture's moving so quickly. If we're quite frank, Councillor Burgo, it's I think the expectations are that people will want that, but I think our application was submitted early last year, so although it doesn't sound like a long period of time, it is quite a lot of things have moved on since then. So if it was a slightly different environment, maybe we would have looked at it. We've been trying to strike the balance of the overall sustainability offer and viability of the scheme, I think is how I'd couch
the only
that.
way I would say that to Percy is that, you know, a lot of these, Dorothy was referring to apartments, but a lot of the apartments obviously first come, first served. And, you know, to have infrastructure there is obviously cheaper in the long run than digging up the road and put it all in at a later date. So, but let me move on because other people want to ask questions. Ian, I think you're next. Ian Leake.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, can I say that I would actually welcome the opportunity to have a discussion with you on some of the technical points that you've raised, which we really can't do properly in these forums, but perhaps you could comment on one or two things, because putting on one side the questions that one can ask about the technology of these things, you mentioned the size of the heat pumps. Now, generally speaking, taking account of the fact that, you know, they're going to be a refrigerator freezer type size, depending on how big your freezer that is, do you see these units being fitted within the curtilage of the house or outside? And the reason I ask the question is because obviously if you fit them inside, this is cutting down on the habitable areas. And if you fit them outside, then there are obviously other factors that you would want to take into account, not least of which is the actual spacing of the housing, which impacts on all sorts of planning issues. So sort of, could you give us a quick spin on where you envisage them fitted?
Yeah, it's a really good question, isn't it? So I mean, just I guess sounds like we're all relatively familiar with the technology, but yeah, the actual pump itself, of course, is what looks about a similar size refrigerator, and predominantly they're fitted internally within the home. Whilst the actual unit, the air source element unit of it, of course, would sit externally and probably doesn't.
She absolutely shattered.
Sorry.
I just struggle with doing two things.
Gareth, can you put yourself on mute?
Gareth, your mic's on. Could you turn the mic off, please?
Ah, right. Yeah, and of course, the actual air source unit, the fan is not dissimilar size to these kind of air conditioning units that you see bolted to the side of offices, albeit in the case of the air source heat pump externally, that will be sat on the ground. So unquestionably, that is eating into space in that home. You know, there's no getting away from that, is there? So house designers will have to start to give consideration to that. I think what's more likely, it's going to be eaten into storage space rather than living space. But we also know that storage space is a problem in homes. You know, one of the common complaints, isn't it? We don't have enough place to store stuff in our home, so we will need to start to look at that really as an industry to figure out where's the best place to site these within the curtilage, and and how is that not going to adversely affect on the living quality of that home?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it worth just Councillor Lee just picking up on the planning point, because it's quite an interesting issue, because I think with homes, I think the slightly smaller outdoor unit that is, I think Robert touched on, is like an air conditioning unit. On larger blocks of apartments, you'll have much more comprehensive air source heat pump systems that will be at roof level or in plant rooms. The government have recently provided some guidance to essentially direct local planning authorities to take into account some of these emerging, essentially visual and design impacts that are going to arise from some of these emerging energy strategies, and essentially to take that into account when they're determining planning applications, to say, if we want to get to these energy and efficiency standards, there are going to be some changes in the way in which our buildings will appear. Some of that will be in window design, screening of windows to stop overheating, all of that kind of thing. So that they're already starting to signal that to local authorities in their decision making around planning, because things will be looking different and will change from where they are at the moment.
Well, good luck on that one then. If I could just move over to the comments that were made about hot water that emanates from these heat pumps. Although you didn't explicitly state it, there was an implication that people would have to change the way they use hot water. Now, for example, at the moment, if my household wants to get a shower, they can get a shower one after the other every morning. Will they be able to do that with a heat pump?
Yeah, so I guess this was the point around the provision of a tank. So at the moment, on a modern home with a combi boiler, it can instantaneously heat water and you could run your shower, ad infinitum. Wouldn't recommend you do so, of course, but if you wanted to, you could do that. Because of the heat pump, because it can't heat water as quickly as that, what it can do, as back to the old ways, it can heat water and store it into a tank. So the tanks should be of suitable size for a 2 to 3 people in a family. That they might have to have special provisions for teenagers, I think, in terms of how they like to shower. But I think you're going to be fine, really. I guess the more lifestyle aspect of a heat pump is the fact that actually what heat pumps don't like to do is cycle. And what I mean by that is, so when you come in, and we're all guilty of this with our gas central heating, you come in on a cold night and you whack your thermostat up and you sit there all cozy and warm, heating your home to about 24, 25 degrees. Well, heat pumps, they can do that, but they're not going to be particularly efficient if you start asking them to do that. So therefore, what you're looking to do is keep your home at a more kind of a favourable comfort temperature of around 19 to 20 degrees. And actually, some people won't like that. Some people won't like the fact that that is the way to operate them in the more efficient way, really. So that, I think, what the onus is being on the house builders to then help educate people moving into these homes and to understand the kind of dynamics at play at how this kit can be operated efficiently, really.
I don't want to be over controversial, but when people say to me, we need to educate people in the way of things, what we're actually saying is you're not going to get the same standard of comfort that you've got now. That's about the size of it, isn't it?
But arguably, yeah. But then I don't know. I live. You probably detect from the accent. I live in Lancashire, on a hill farm in Lancashire, and I have underfloor heating. I have a biomass boiler, and I can't get my heating up to past 20 degrees. So in the winter, believe it or not, I don't sit there in T-shirts and shorts. I have pants on and a jumper. So I actually don't think that's a bad thing to be sitting watching TV with a jumper on and some trousers rather than sitting there in a vest and some shorts. But that's just my personal point of view, I should add, not the view of Countryside. Okay,
and the final comment I'd like to make is that a short while ago, I think Tony mentioned, or I'll rephrase that, at one of our earlier meetings, we had a gentleman from, I think it was one of the electricity, South East Electricity, it might have been another board, I'm not too sure, And I asked him that obviously they know what the total capacity of their network is at any particular time, and they know what the total demand is at any one time. And I asked him that if they got to a point where they had a peak demand on their network, 5, 6, 7 o'clock in the evening, that sort of thing. If they had that peak demand and everybody then plugged in their electric charging vehicle at a 7.5 kilowatt charger, how many extra cars could it take before the network collapsed? He hadn't got a clue. How are you going to tackle that issue? And what as a company, because obviously as individual consumers, we can do absolutely nothing. The power utilities take no notice of the individual consumer at all. As an organisation that's building homes, you hopefully have more influence on them. What are you doing to ensure that they're generating networks which can take the demand that's required, and equally importantly, fitting houses with probably at least a 50, 60, 70 amp circuit that's going to be able to take these charges?
Oh yeah, there's a few good kind of questions tucked in there, isn't there? I guess I mean, first and foremost, of course, when you're talking about these utility organisations, these district network operators, they're of course a statutory consultee. So what we do, we would lay out the design of a development, how many homes, what kind of power it's going to need, and it's for them, if you like, to then design the infrastructure to meet that demand. So I mean, so if you like, the burden of responsibility will sit with them. And of course,
can I just stop you there? I do actually understand that, because I've been in the construction industry a while. What I'm saying is that you can tell them, the homes, but are you actually telling them that, for example, if you're fitting chargers, then they've got to take into account that some people, not everybody, will be able to afford maybe a 15, maybe a higher kilowatt charging unit. Are you asking them to ensure that their circuits can take the higher ampage fuses that they have to fit into the main circuit boards for the properties? And are they actually doing that? Because if that's not happening, then that's going to limit the take-up of charging points and the capacity to charge the vehicles when people need it.
Again, I say you do raise some interesting points. I guess in terms of the internal electric units and infrastructure within the home, of course, building regulations determine what what that will look like. In terms of the challenge to the district network operators, can they meet the demand? Then I guess that's something that we have to take on good faith in all respects, isn't it? We lay out what the expectations are for that development, what its demand going to be at peak time and non-peak times. It's for them to determine whether or not they can then meet that demand, and if not, then bring that to our attention. I think something that's going to be really helpful on this front is these EV chargers that can monitor what's going on in the external environment and charge the vehicle up accordingly. So the time-based tariffs, there's a few different terms to use, but basically what it does, you plug your car in, it knows that you plugged in at a peak demand time. It won't charge that car until past peak demand. And what you can then do then is tap into time of use tariffs, which are of course much cheaper. And I think, so you're going to see a lot more of that, of this demand side management as it's described, as people have been a bit more sensible as to when they actually do need that electricity, because that car doesn't need to be charged at 7 o'clock. It needs to be charged up when you go to work in the morning. So therefore that charging process can commence at midnight and carry on through till 4:30, 5 o'clock. So the technology is there to support that. And it's actually more beneficial for the homeowner to key into those kind of tariffs to save themselves money. So I think it's a bit of a balancing act, I think, in that regard.
I understand that. I suppose, in a way, that's another thing that people are going to have to get used to, that if I want to take a drive, or I need to leave home at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, I can take my car now and fill it up. I'm not going to be able to do that with an electric vehicle. And I think that there is, I think we're all avoiding the issue of actually telling people that when these things come in, they've actually got to accept that there are going to be some restrictions on their lifestyle. And it's that aspect of it which bothers me and that I don't believe is being communicated properly. Gareth, you need to turn your microphone off again.
Remind a phone call to the office is all that was needed. None of us are perfect.
Gareth, your mic is on. Thank you. Thank you, Ian, for your question. Couple of points. I've had someone actually text me while they're watching this broadcast about thermal batteries, thermal battery technology, Robert, and how that would help us in these situations.
Yeah.
I don't know what's happening with your computer, but you're broadcasting. And thermal battery technology, and how and whether that would help us in really cold winters. It's the cold winter I think everyone's kind of scared about, actually. That's the first point. And the second point is, I thought we had thermal tiles, you know, some solar tile technology, so that the roof tiles could in fact be solar. Therefore, they would fit in the normal house, but they would be solar tiles. I haven't seen that, but I remember reading about it a long time ago. So I don't know whether that's also something that's coming along. I'm just thinking of style and planning and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it's just in terms of just picking up on the thermal batteries piece, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think what society's going to have to start to look to do is when we're at what's sometimes known as kind of peak generation. So, for example, with a solar panel, it's at peak generation, obviously, at a point in the day where traditionally people were at the home, really. So that's why people kind of promoted this idea of the use of batteries. But the economics of batteries still don't really add up at the moment. But of course, the case of a thermal battery is, or sometimes described as a heat store. I think that's the kind of the point they're making, is that, again, make use of peak generation capacity to heat water up in a very large tank, super insulated tank, and of course then throughout the course of the evening and the night time draw upon that, really. The challenge, of course, to thermal stores or thermal batteries is you're looking at fairly sizable volumes. Now, in fact, they are thermal batteries, if we're all talking about the same thing, aren't in place on large apartment schemes in some cases in these energy centres, where they will make use of peak generation to store that water in those thermal stores. But unless you've got a very large home or an outbuilding, you might struggle to have that kind of thermal heat store. And the solar tiles, I am familiar with the technology. I know Elon Musk and Tesla were looking at it. I'm not so sure if I've seen it happening with volume house building at the moment. And that's not to say it won't do at a point in the future. Certainly, we're in regular contact with a lot of these suppliers with these new technologies. Obviously, they're keen to sell us their wares. So if they do start to gain traction, I've no doubt we'll be approached by them.
That's it. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. I know Sandra's been very patient. Sandra, waiting. And your mic's off, Sandra. We can't hear you.
How about that?
That's much better.
Okay, there we go. Yes. Right, so thank you very much for your presentation. And I was very impressed because you clearly understand your value chain and where the carbon emissions are coming from. And with 72% of the carbon emissions currently coming from people living in your new homes, it struck me that, and this may be grossly oversimplifying things, but I started to visualize a two-track nationwide approach of the fast track for new developments, new homes, and then a slow track for those householders who live in older homes or very old homes. And as a country, we've all got to get there together, haven't we, by 2050? So my question is, does your strategy include the wider macro issues of homes of all ages and how you can impact and help those householders? I know you've spoken about retrofitting. Perhaps do you advise central government, or is there a, do you take that into account?
I mean, at present, of course, we're a builder of new homes, and I guess our business model means that when we've built those homes, whilst we still, of course, have a duty of care to make sure that the right stewardship processes are in place, by and large, of course, those homes are handed over to householders or our partners and then run in perpetuity. So I guess the short answer to that is no in terms of the second house home market, the older homes. And there's an interesting article came out, I think it was just this week on that actually, is that they've looked at the economics of some of these houses, and particularly the ones that are of a lower economic value, and there will need to be public subsidies to support the retrofit. The economics of them don't add up. So if you've got a house, I think the numbers they were quoted, say 160 to £200,000, the economic outlay to improve its insulation or improve its heating system will not be recovered in its sale value. So there will need to be public subsidies, unquestionably, for those kind of homes going forward. And that's not even starting to think about the logistics of doing that for many different house types spread across the country, many different typologies, and in some cases, planning restrictions on them if they're, of course, older properties or listed properties. So yeah, that is going to be the single biggest challenge for the UK in terms of decarbonisation, is tackling that area. Huge problem.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for understanding it.
Okay, thank you very much, Sandra, that. And the last question we've got is from Gareth.
Thank you very much, Tony. So my question is, it's great to have all this capital investment in all these new technologies. And we know that as technologies improve, their longevity get better. But do we have an assessment about the ongoing cost to support these technologies in houses? Because if a photovoltaic delaminates or something happens to that, it's relatively expensive to replace. And our study's being done that demonstrates that over, let's say, a 25, 30-year period, that the cost of investing in this technology, given the offset and reduction in energy prices, and the added value possibly to a property by having this, actually means that this isn't just the preserve of those that can afford to do it, but actually becomes a viable option, maybe with a level of subsidy for everyone. Because I'm struck that if you look at the cost of heat pumps, if you look at the cost of doing a significant photovoltaic installation, those outlays are not necessarily attractively worse. So, it's that whole, what I call communication value proposition around these technologies, which we know needs to happen for environmental reasons, but do they happen for economic reasons as well?
Oh yeah, that's a question. I'm not asking an easy question, more on sport or something. It's a valid point, isn't it? And again, this picks up back on this kind of retrofit discussion, doesn't it? At the moment, is that the economics of replacing a gas boiler with a heat pump in an older properties, where you're looking at around $5,000 to $6,000, I guess, for a new heating system with a gas boiler, and that's if you like taking in and replacing radiators. Whilst you're looking at anywhere up to about £12,000 for the installation of a heat pump, there's obviously a massive disparity between the two. And previously, the government's renewable heat incentive, which I managed to get from my biomass boiler, has helped to address that in terms of that initial capital outlay, really. Back to that point, there will need to continue to be some kind of public subsidy around some of these heating systems until economies of scale drives down that price. And I know the government is setting a challenge out for particularly heat pump manufacturers to reduce the cost of those heat pumps by 50%. And I guess, again, economies of scale will move it in that direction, but it's not going to be moving quick enough to then detach itself from public subsidy, really. And I guess maybe the point around life cycle replacement, life cycle costs, I think that the numbers are there to substantiate the outlay for the likes of solar panels. They will, if they don't last forever, of course. Some of them have different life cycle or lifetime replacement regimes, but by and large, you'll recover your money through those panels, through the energy they will save you throughout their life, really, and hopefully a little bit more to boot to then play for their replacement. So I kind of danced about as an answer to that question, because perhaps there's something we don't fully know yet, really, as an industry or even society, the real true costs of this transition.
I think that's a very open answer, Robert. Thank you for that, because I think ultimately at the end of the day that has to be the value proposition. You've got the environmental side, but also you've got for the household or the house owner, particular mortgageable properties and things like that, what is going to be the cost of maintaining that technology? Because history is littered with great ideas, but some fundamental flaws found down the line, and we won't even get going on the longevity of lithium-ion batteries and things like that. But that's another debate for elsewhere. But I've been really impressed tonight, Tony, with this presentation. I think it's a really positive step forward in terms of how we look at new build design and actually how air source heat pumps and other technologies can work together.
Okay, thank you very much, Gareth, and thank you to Robert and to Percy, and we appreciate you coming along and talking to us. And I'm sure both of you, perhaps you can come back at a later time and sort of update us, because you know the panel is very interested in this, and some of us sit on the planning committee, and you know, we're very keen on pushing this as much as we can with developers and obviously in yourselves and so on. So, but anyway, from everyone, thank you very much, Robert, and thank you, Percy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye. You can stay and watch this. I know you want to.
Unfortunately, yeah, I've got a dog to walk, unfortunately.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on then to the strategy, the next big thing of the evening. And I would call in Damien to help us on this. Welcome, Damien, to everyone watching. And Damien James has been assembling this with Kevin Gibbs, who's not with us this evening. But I've asked members really to look at this and come up with ideas and any thoughts that we need to change. But anyway, do you want to talk us through it, and then we can have questions, Damien?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chairman, and good evening, members. So what I tend to do this evening, if I just share my screen, is run through a presentation which essentially brings out kind of the main points from the strategy update. So the commitment really that was given with this strategy when it was agreed by the executive, it was in 2021, was really to come back on an annual basis and update the strategy. Clearly, we come before the panel on a quarterly basis at the moment with quarterly updates, but this is the first annual strategy update that this panel has seen. And I think it's probably worth pointing out right at the beginning that climate change for Bracknell Forest Council, this is not a new, whilst it's a new strategy, we have been working on climate change since before 2007 with the Nottingham Declaration. So this is a kind of iterative process really with this new strategy, and clearly there is a real focus from the advisory panel on this as well. So I'll just, if I put this into presentation mode, hopefully you can see that. This is what I'm just going to be touching on this evening, and some of this will be quite familiar to members who have been on this panel and will have seen the quarterly updates as well. But firstly, I should mention that the climate change strategy is prominent now on our website. It can be found from the homepage of the Bracknell Forest Council website, and there's a wealth of information on there, including obviously the link to the strategy document and also links to our action plan, which sits beneath our strategy. And just remind members that we had a kind of four-pronged approach to our strategy from 2020 to 2024, working with partners, preserving the climate beneficial elements from COVID-19, working with schools and young people, and then preserving the natural environment. And again, to refresh people's memory, the council has responsibility for direct emissions, which equate to about 2% of the borough's emissions, and we also then have influence and need to lead community action against climate change for the remaining 98% of emissions in the borough. So just to reflect back on some of the meetings that the advisory panel has had over the last, I think it's September prior to September last year, but we've got this list from September, starting with electric vehicles back in September, and then deep dives into the Warm Homes project, which members will remember, I'm sure. Local power generation we've discussed in January, and then public sector decarbonisation in March. At the last meeting, we had a very interesting session discussing biodiversity, with presentations from our own team in natural estates, Berks, Bucks and Oxon Wildlife Trust, the Crown Estate and the Warfield Environment Group. And today, obviously, we've heard from Countryside, and I'm doing the annual update, which will be going through to full council next month. And then looking forward, the next couple of meetings, there's an item on local power generation in relation to hydrogen, potentially for September, and then again in November, looking forward to that, a walking and cycling strategy review, and the quarterly update as well from the executive director. So in terms of the annual reports, this was the motion that was passed back in 2019, in July 2019, which committed the council to becoming net zero, a net zero emitting gas borough by 2050. And it talked about the annual report coming to full council, which obviously this is the first edition of that report. And there's start with a couple of headline metrics, if I may. So this is in relation to Bracknell Forest Council's own emissions from our own zone, if you like. So this would include our own transport vehicles, gas, electric and water consumption within those numbers there. And you can see clearly a reducing pattern over the last 3 years, which is a positive direction. And if you look at emissions across the borough, this is data that's supplied by the Business Energy and Industrial Strategy Department, and slightly behind the data that we can produce that I've just shown you on the slide before, but again showing a positive trend in terms of reduction, and actually that's just over a 41% reduction in borough emissions since the monitoring took place, started in 2005. By the way, all of this information is in the review report, which you've got in your pack, yeah, so I've just picked out some of the highlights. So hopefully you've read that document, and there's much more detail in that. So just a couple of strategic highlights, if I may, from 21-22. One of the things that we did very early on was embed climate change within our decision-making process. So members will certainly be aware of our report templates that we have within the organisation for decision making, and there's a very formal and rightly so structure for that, but we've now included climate change impacts on all of those decision making reports. So authors of those reports and members will have to consider those impacts as part of the overall decision. So any time a decision is made, climate change is reviewed, comments are input into the report as to how the impact might affect climate change, and any mitigation that can be taken into consideration. The service plan process that we have just gone through for 22-23 has again also embedded climate change within those service plans. And again, in relation to public health, there are a number of programs within the public health team that have impacted on climate change over the last 12 months, and some examples in that bullet point there. Some other highlights from this year. So we've undertaken a business survey, and this wasn't specifically around climate change, but we inserted a number of climate change impact questions within that survey. And this was done by our economic development team. Some of the data we've seen there, and I'm sure members will want to comment on this, but 51% of businesses having the intention of being more environmentally friendly, but just 12% having a specific target, and just 5% having set a deadline to that commitment. So clearly further work to be done with businesses in the borough, and that's one of the things that we're going to be focusing on as the kind of one of the four strands that we looked at is engaging with those businesses this year and working with them to encourage them and coerce them to set targets and have specific targets to achieving net zero. In terms of funding, we've been pretty successful this year in relation to funding, and I'll touch on some of that in a second, but we've had a number of ministers at our closed landfill site this year looking at options around solar charging, solar array and storage batteries on that site. And again, that's captured within the report. And we've been very fortunate to have just completed the Schools Climate Change Conference. So this was something that we said we would do just prior to COVID, and unfortunately it was impacted by the pandemic and delayed, but that took place and was very successful last month. And obviously Councillor Barnard was on the call who chaired that session, and it was involving all of our secondary schools except one, and it was really successful. Had some really good presentations from pupils within those schools and some great ideas as well. So we'll be working with schools again in this coming year to encourage them to develop some of those ideas further. In terms of some grant funding, and again, we've covered some of these on the quarterly reports previously, but we've been successful in getting funding for heat decarbonisation projects, active travel initiatives, EV charging points and air quality this year, and all of those projects are ongoing to improve in those areas, and we continue to apply for funding where we can. So just touching on the Public Protection Partnership Air Quality Initiative. So they have had this grant awarded to them by DEFRA. One of the first things that they have undertaken so far is designing a bumper sticker with schools involved. So again, it's about that engagement with young people and hearing and developing the ideas that young people come forward with. And that was the winning entry you can see there from a year 6 pupil in Ascot Heath Primary School. And those bumper stickers are gradually getting out and about and looking at encouraging and just informing the public about turning off their engines when they are when it's suitable to do so. And just in relation to air quality, we do have 2 air quality management areas within the borough. And again, these are monitored very closely by the Public Protection Partnership and reported on an annual basis to DEFRA. And those of you who follow the Public Protection Committee minutes will see that the latest 2021 DEFRA submission has just been signed off in relation to those 2 areas. And again, a bit more on funding. We have now spent our initial tranche of £900,000 on Green Homes grant funding. That was the first phase. And the third phase, we have been, we were initially unsuccessful, but we have been now told that we've been awarded £1 million of funding. So we are working hard to make sure that's spent appropriately within the borough to improve energy efficiency within homes who are the kind of poorest in terms of efficiency. So our team are working closely with those residents in the borough. And there's some further funding there as part of the second phase, which we are spending up until the end of this month. So again, some positive news in funding. And then in terms of the actual action plan, we've got currently 46 live projects or initiatives. I chair the Internal Officer Board and collect information from the officers who are working on those specific action projects, and then that information is fed through to members through the advisory panel and to the executive to update members on progress with those actions. And again, you can see it covers a wide range of departments within the organisation. So this is from Highways and Transport and some of the work that they've been doing in relation to electric vehicles, which you heard about back in September. Parks and Countryside have been key to our climate change initiatives. A significant amount of tree planting that has happened in the last 12 months, almost 2,800 trees over 20 sites, and that will continue. And again, you can see some other work they've been doing in terms of habitats, increasing the number of them and the number of hectares, and also looking at putting into practice some of the items that Countryside were just talking about around ground source heat pumps or air source heat pumps. We're looking at ground source at Westmoreland Park at the moment and increasing rainwater harvesting at a number of sites following some trials at the Lookout and Westmoreland Park. In Highways and Transport, again, there's a partnership around the Eco Rewards scheme, looking to incentivize local schools and residents to choose sustainable travel options. And so far, that scheme has seen 45,000 green miles in the last quarter being reported, so is gaining popularity. And again, there'll be a widespread consultation coming up on walking and cycling habits within the borough. In fact, I believe that's just happened to better inform planning on improved infrastructure. For those of you who are familiar with some of the work that my team do, focused on greening our waste this last financial year, which has been a huge success with the participation of our residents. So in the first year, we recycled over 6,000 tonnes of food waste, which was diverted from landfill. And that has succeeded in giving us a recycling rate for last financial year of 56%, which is a 13% improvement on the year before, which is very, very significant. And the participation in the food waste scheme is exceptionally high, with around 90% of households participating, and that compares very favourably compared to other authorities who have introduced food schemes of around 60 to 70%. So the combination of moving to weekly food waste collections whilst introducing 3 weekly refuse collections has resulted in that high participation rate. The additional increase in recycling, but it has also reduced our waste ending up in landfill, which has halved, more than halved actually, down to 7%, which is below our annual target of 10%. And again, you can see a significant CO2 equivalent saving for the first year as a result of that. So just some pictorials which perhaps make it easier. So the blue line on this graph was our target of food waste, tons of food per month. The green line was the 21-22 numbers, and you can see an average line there. And actually, we're pleased that the trend is downwards, because what we should be doing is not throwing away our food. We should be using all of our food. So we're hoping that trend will continue downwards. And what we're also doing is doing a marketing campaign and communications campaign, talking about how residents can reduce their food waste and use more of the food that they buy, and making sure that if they don't want the food, they don't buy it in the first place. This is our reduction in landfill. As you can see, going back to 2015-16, and again a significant drop in our percentage of waste landfill, which is really encouraging. And again, this results in our increase in recycling. So 56% for last financial year, which is a significant increase. And then just some work some other teams have been doing. You'll be aware of the work the communications team do, but we've had a significant amount of press coverage in relation to climate change, which is really positive. So we've had at least one story every 2 weeks, and 110 press stories issued in the last financial year through a variety of means. social media, e-newsletters, our borough-wide magazine, Town and Country, and local media outlets. And events like the Forest Giants that we had last year, and the water in the town centre this year, and again Forest Giants coming back later in the year, all help to contribute to that message of climate change and how we can all have an impact about reducing climate change. So a couple of key projects moving forward, the last couple of slides. The commercial centre is our what some people will know as our depot. It is currently being rebuilt, and the redesigned commercial centre will have some significant energy saving greening elements. So a green roof on the office accommodation, which will provide thermal insulation, PV panels, and heating via an air source heat pump as well. So and we will have a number of electric vehicle charging points in the depot, and the facility to install more should we want to do that. We've had funding awarded to us of £100,000 to roll out 32 residential charging points. And again, that's just going through the planning process at the moment, but those will be going in across borough shopping centres. Some work that Public Health are helping with in terms of eco rewards, Get Green and Active, and home improvement works, working with my team. And again, the food waste collection scheme, we're just starting to roll out to up to 20% of flats within the borough. So the first 150 properties went live a couple of weeks ago. We were just monitoring those to see how they go, but so far so good. And we'll be rolling that out further throughout this financial year. And Chairman, thank you. That's all of my slides. I will stop sharing and go to any questions that we may have. Thank you.
It's very kind. Well done, Damien, and thank you for going through all that. And for those people looking in and looking at this, it's very comprehensive, and I think you've done a really good job, to be honest with you. But there's more to do. I'd like to start this off, actually, if I could, because I know Mark is here too. And I'm not quite sure how to do this, Damien, because I don't want to hog all this, because lots of people have questions. But things like you said about the businesses are kind of the way it's written. I think it does seem like the businesses don't care. I'm sure that's not the truth. And actually, I've talked briefly. Well, I haven't talked, but we conversed to Mark. But I've also talked to Bob Wade as well, because he was going to appear, but he couldn't tonight. But the fact is, of course, he said that, of course, a lot of the businesses are struggling to survive, let alone deal with climate change. But, Mark, do you want to say a few words? Because I think we could write a bit more about this to explain, because if people pick it up, they'll just look at it and think,
Yeah, I tend to agree. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to just talk to this briefly late as the hour. I think Bob has said it right. I mean, he's one of our business champions. Anchor's obviously the other one as well. We've just come through a couple of years of COVID. There's still a huge amount of uncertainty over Brexit, over the state of the economy and everything else. And I think that genuinely, the feedback I get from businesses is that it's not that they're interested. It's not that they're not interested, sorry. It's just they have other priorities right now which are of equal or greater importance, most of which is survival. And one business I spoke to, I'll save blushes by not mentioning who they are, but they said, look, if I focus all my attention on becoming carbon neutral by 2050 or 2030, and I fail to keep an eye on the bottom line, I won't have a company. And if I don't have a company, then any actions I take now to reduce climate change or the impact of climate change are meaningless. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a very important narrative. It's absolutely not that they're not interested. I mean, that's just not the case. It's just there is greater priorities. One of the things I think is most relevant here is when you look at the work of the Thames Valley Berkshire LEP, of which I'm currently the deputy chairman, and the work that they've been doing. I mean, they've got some amazing low carbon technology colleges that set up as well. And then you look at the work of the BID in some of the work they're doing across southern and western business areas. And then most importantly of all, our key partner in all of this is the Economic Skills Development Partnership, the ESDP. This has been discussed at great length through the ESDP as recently, I think, as the last meeting. One of the things that they're quite keen to do is to set up a working group or a subgroup that looks specifically at how companies can be helped on the journey. And it's not just a matter of carrot and stick, because that doesn't always work. What it comes down to is helping and educating and guiding, and here's some things you could do, or here are things you can try. So I think maybe a comment on the narrative when it's presented. I think we all know that they're not interested, but I just think we need to make that point clear. I'm proud of the work that many of our businesses in Bracknell Forest have done to address climate change already. I think all of them will admit there's more work to do. Same with everybody, no one is perfect. But there are some amazing stories of things that are being done out there by businesses large and small. And one of the things that I've asked the ESDP to do is to try and capture some of that and show exemplars of what can be done with minimal effort or with minimal investment. And I think that's the other part of it, Chairman, is actually there is an investment cost here. And again, it comes back to that same point that until there's some more certainty and people are surviving and the economic pressures are off, I think the investment in large scale carbon schemes, I mean, for example, of replacing a warehouse roof with solar panels, for example, is just beyond the economic case. But I would be delighted to come back and update either myself or Bob or Anchor in his role as one of the chairman. I'd be great to maybe get the ESDP to come along and give a little section at a future meeting. We're all over this, and I'm proud of a lot of the work that's being done already. There's more to do, and I'd love the opportunity to, once the ESDP has kind of stood up its work, to come back and update you.
Okay, I think that's good, Mark, and I think this should be in the report. So, and I know, Damien, this is a kind of draft, isn't it, of what we're going to do. So I think that would be good, and I presume, Damien, the best thing is to get some ideas together and whip it to you and Kevin, and is that the way to do it? And just to embellish a bit more background as to why these figures are a bit low.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, so there is some additional information we could put in there, which will give some context to the numbers that are in the report. Obviously, it's going through to full council next month, so that's the deadline that we have, and we need to work around that and make sure that members are happy with the content that's in the report. So it's your report to.
Chairman, may I make a suggestion? Would it be okay if I work directly with Damien and Kevin? Sure. I think I get the sentiment of what I've had comments from other people, and I'm most grateful for those comments. If I work very quickly with Damien in the next couple of days, maybe because of the timelines, I think it just needs a little bit of narrative added. I don't think it's war and peace. A couple of lines that just sort of set some of that context, pass it back through to the panel, get feedback, and then we can lock it in rather than kind of designing it by committee.
Sure.
If that's okay, I'll take that action.
Yeah, and good idea. The other thing I would say, and I'm going to pass this to the floor, is that I think it needs also, I mean, clearly we've done a lot of work here, Damien, and, people will see this and be satisfied in a sense. But I think what they want is a roadmap to where we're going. I think they want to know what's our aspirations and how we're going to include, I mean, this is how Mark's going to come in here, how we're going to include the wider community into our thinking of climate change, because they see Bracknell Forest Borough Council as a guideline, as a master, as a kind of inspirator. And I think we need to show that with a lot of confidence. And I would be very happy to help and suggest things and so on, and realize the timeline is short, but I think it needs to do, because this is a project which is going to stand up with other councils, and I want us to be the best.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would say is obviously the report is predominantly looking at what we've undertaken in the last 12 months. So it's a backward review, if you like, to update full council on the progress that we've made in our journey. There is a section about looking forward. It's a relatively light section looking forward because that's not the purpose of the report. It's to review what we've done. So there's certainly some room in there to add additional look forward elements if you would like, Chairman.
With respect, I know that's the kind of that's the protocol, but nevertheless, I think people want to know the future. We're a country now where we're going to hit some very, very strong winds, and we want to know that this council is prepared for that and where it's going. And I think that's really important as far as Chairman is concerned. I'm going to open this up a bit. I've said enough. I'm going to start with the top here. Sandra, do you want to have a go first of all, please?
Okay, thank you, Chair. And I do agree with you totally. This is a strategy that we're talking about, and a strategy is a roadmap. So my question, Damien, is what will be, in your opinion, what will be the biggest challenges going forward to the borough achieving net zero by 2050? And, are we once we've identified those biggest issues, are we putting plans in place to tackle them? So those plans are in place now. And as a sort of a sideline to that is where we say that the council emissions are less than 2% carbon emissions. And so we have to influence the 98%. Could that 98% be perhaps broken down so that we understand, how much percentage of that would be householders, how much percentage would be businesses, how much percentage would be road traffic passing through the borough, just so we can identify key sort of stakeholder areas and then formulate plans for reaching them.
Thank you, Councillor Ingham. You've actually answered your own question there, because that's the most difficult thing in my mind, is influencing those 98%. And there'll be many in that 98% that want to be engaged and want to do their bit and reduce their emissions and change some of the things that they do on a daily basis in order to have that impact. But we don't control those 98%. We can influence them, we can talk to them, we can encourage them, we can coerce them. But ultimately, individuals and businesses will need to either through regulation, which will come down the track, or through choice, make different choices in order to reduce our emissions. So that, in my mind, is the biggest challenge that we have at the moment. But yes, certainly in terms of the second part of your question, we can look at breaking down that 98% into chunks to see where the key stakeholders might be, and see if we can then work out the best way to influence those stakeholders.
Absolutely. That would be a great help, because that would really help the monitoring as well, won't it? Okay, thank you. That's hopeful. And Mark, I'm so glad to hear positive stories coming out of the business community, because it is largely about survival. And as a small business director, I do know that, but it'd be great to hear all the good news. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. Thanks, Mark. The other thing is, we did talk about a town and country, a special edition, I think. I don't know where we are with that, but let's pose that as a question and see if we can get an answer. I'm just going through people who have asked to speak. John, I know John Harrison hasn't spoke so far, so John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, I think Sandra was asking some really good questions. I think they were quite interesting questions earlier about small businesses. And I think what we need to reflect here is the same forces that are acting on small businesses are the same ones that are acting on households at the moment. That some of the spending profile is quite similar. So they'll have transport costs, they'll have heating costs, lighting costs, and so on. And the huge spike in the price of mainly petrol, diesel, and and gas for heating is really affecting small businesses as well. I know a number of businesses that have actually ditched having offices because it's too much of an expense to deal with that, and especially post-COVID, actually have everybody working from home. And even though they are working from home, they're still incurring expenditure. So the actions that we're taking that are helping householders, such as putting more EV charging points in, are going to be the same ones that are helping small businesses. They'll be able to access that network as well. And I've got some good news to announce now, which I think you may be the first to hear because we haven't put the press release out yet. Damien probably knows about this already. At Lily Hill Park, we're going to put a number of charging points in. We've got the work being done over June. Hopefully they'll be in by the end of July and usable. And that's really good because it means that people living nearby who maybe don't have a driveway, don't have anywhere to park their car except on the road, and don't have a charging point to use, may be able to use that for charging for a couple of hours before they go to work or whatever, or even maybe charge overnight. And also a particular point for the householders who live on that road is that we had a catering van, I think they're called Ziggy's, that were having to run a generator, which was quite noisy, in order to supply electricity to that catering van. And now they'll be able to access an electricity supply. So it'll be peaceful evenings for the neighbours, and it'll be a chance for people to charge at one of our parks. And this is just one of the things. We were actually quite successful and quite grateful to officers for dealing with this in applying for a grant from the Zero Emissions Vehicle Fund that's given us the ability to do that. And I think that's what Damien was talking about earlier with some of the rollout of charge points across the borough. So it's another example of how, as a council, we are able to help people reduce their emissions. But I think expecting small businesses to produce a carbon reduction plan and all that sort of documentation is too much for them. It's not something they're going to be able to do. It's something that will happen through the decarbonisation of the whole economy as we reduce carbon emissions from transport, from fuel, from electricity generation and so on. It will happen naturally, and people will do what they can where they can. But expecting every small business to put out statements on it, it's not going to happen.
Okay.
I think we'll go with the flow there.
All right. Thank you, John. I'd like to see that actually in the town and country. That would be great. And tell everyone. Let's go to Mary Temperton, please.
It was Gareth next, Tony.
Yeah, I'm going to give Mary. I'm chairman. I'd like to give it to Mary next, please. Thank you. Mary.
Thank you. The biggest worry for many people is the loss of heat from their houses, because it's a double good thing if you can produce a lot of heat, because if you can reduce the amount of heat you're losing, because you then don't have to keep buying so much. And Silver Homes, I know when we had the report about the help, Silver Homes were being helped to go for a government grant to actually provide better insulation in their homes, but they didn't get that. And I wondered if the council is continuing to help housing associations, and Bracknell Forest has a lot of housing associations. So what's happening with the other housing associations? Are they managing to get grants to refit their houses, the existing houses? And also, there are some, I know it's really hard for finding extra cash at the moment. I understand that. Mm-hmm. But there are many houses and house owners who would also very much like to improve the insulation within their homes. Mm. The only thing they can do at the moment is get stuff for the loft. But for my house, for instance, upstairs, and all the big houses with the white boarding all over the front, upstairs is a nightmare. It's just a breeze block and then a boarding, or breeze block and then a tile. So all the Waits houses or whatever are a bit of a disaster as far as loss of heat. And this is all over Bracknell Forest, these sort of houses. So what can be done? Are you ever able to get a workforce together? Can we encourage Bracknell Forest to have a workforce together to help that we could recommend to be able to do this work for people? Because it's a big gamble at the moment. And people will be more likely to actually make that investment if they knew there was some sort of check on the workforce that's being employed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. If I can just pick up a couple of those points, Chairman. So yeah, just in terms of the funding with Silver Homes, yeah, you're correct, Councillor Templeton. They weren't successful, which was a shame. And we've had a session with Silver Homes to try and talk through what the issues might have been in relation to that grant funding. There is another tranche of funding, we believe, coming up later this year, and again, we'll be working with Silver Homes if that comes off to put in an application, having learnt, I guess, some lessons maybe from the last round of funding. In terms of other housing associations, I'd have to go and check. Actually, I don't have an answer for you this evening, but I can have a look into that to see what other work we're doing. You know, Hazel, one of our officers, who is an expert in terms of home efficiency, and she manages a very comprehensive house database, which contains information on those properties which are the least well insulated within the borough, and those are the ones where we are actively targeting when we've got grant funding to
understand
to spend. So clearly there's a priority list in terms of the ones that we can help, and we're focusing on those, the most needy first, the least efficient first, and that database now covers more than 98% of the borough. So a very, very comprehensive database, which we're working on well. And we are one of the first, if not the first, borough to achieve an average EPC rating of C in the country. So again, we recognise there's lots more to do, but we are, working in the right direction.
I just wonder, we talked about this earlier, I think, Damien, but I wonder if we should look, and I know this needs legislation, and I need it needs all kinds of government legislation, but I wonder if part of the SIL or the 106 should be there to help us fund some of these things, because clearly it's a bit of a pea in the ocean, this, and there are a lot of houses in our borough, frankly, private as well, I might add, that don't have lots of money, not just state ones, that need insulation, and we need to do this slowly and carefully but thoroughly.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Again, I'm not an expert on SIL or 106. It's not my area of expertise, but I guess there are limitations as to what we can spend that money on at the moment, and we obviously have to comply with that. Unless those limitations are changed, then we're kind of stuck where we are. But there's always an opportunity to lobby if we want to change those.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Mary.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you both.
No
Thank you.
Thank you. Gareth, you're next.
Thank you, Chair. So, I mean, first one observation, I think, as David said, the schools conference was fantastic, and big thanks to a lot of people from across the council that put time into that. And I think what's really great is I think we're going to be able to, based on some work that you're doing, actually advance, some finance to the schools to actually take those projects forward. So I think that's very positive. And actually that goes to the core of my next comment, which is I get the fact that in terms of climate change, it's what we do next. But I think it's really important we actually say a huge thank you by accurate reporting back on what we've achieved over the last year to our residents, because it just demonstrates that if lots of people make a small change, the cumulative effect is a big change. And walking around the conference, I think that's the really strong thing that young people get, is that they know that on their own, if they do a little bit of recycling or they challenge their families to do some more recycling, it won't make a big difference, but they all get and recognise the fact that it will cumulatively make a significant impact. So the thing I'd like to see, it's a fantastic report, Damien, in terms of reporting about what we've done. But I think for a special town and country or item, we need to try and reduce it to something which people can relate to.
Yeah.
In terms of the so many tons of carbon dioxide doesn't mean anything. But if we can equate that to the number of cars, that the average use of a car, or the volume, what that looks to in terms of, I think the classic one is Olympic swimming pools or something. I think it's that sort of thing, because we have got a really good story to tell. But then I think what we say at the end of it, okay, we've done all this, so this is how you want to help us in the you know, the next 6 months to a year. Because what struck me was how fantastic residents were in terms of embracing 3 weekly green bin collections. You know, there's no doubt it was a challenge, but look at the numbers, they speak for themselves, and our residents have been fantastic in terms of what they've done. So that's where I'm coming from. I think it's great we look forward, but I think we've got to really make sure we thank people for what they've done so far, because that's how I think we will encourage people to do more in the months and years ahead.
I absolutely agree with you, Gareth. And I think the message, a simple message for people and how they can help and how they can join this is the way forward. Because I think, you know, people looking at this think that's fine, but how can the whole of the borough work towards working the same thing? And I know that we've talked about getting someone from you know, from James, the MP, on this committee, and a few other parish councils. I think then, you know, you start this movement moving, and you can only change with people's appreciation and agreement.
It's with people's consent, Tony, and I think, you know, it's a tough couple of years. And I think our residents have done magnificently to get us to where we have. I mean, look at those recycling rates. Look at the reduction, the amount going to landfill. I mean, these are long-term sustainable changes, and getting that message over to say you've done this much, just think how much more we can do.
And they're also keen to help, Gareth.
And look at how much money we've saved by not paying that landfill tax. You know, look at how much money we've actually saved. Look at, you know, all the subsidiary benefits there are. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm no marketing expert, but I'd like to thank Damien and his team for everything that they've done on this, putting it together, because I think it's a very, very good report.
Indeed. Okay, Gareth, thank you. Dorothy.
Can I just come back on a few things
Yes,
from?
of course.
Sorry, Councillor Hayes. I just wanted.
You're my team, you know that.
I just wanted to reflect on a couple of things that Councillor Barnard picked up on, and the thing that strikes me, particularly around the food waste collections, is, you know, when individuals say that what they do doesn't make a huge difference. I think what you can see through the food waste collection is that one individual becomes a whole borough, and actually, if everybody collects their 9-10 litres worth of food every week, it becomes a huge volume. And that's why we've got such a reduction in our landfill and such an increase in our recycling, because everyone's come together, which is really helpful. So every individual does matter, and every individual can do something. And the other thing I would say is actually, again, learning from our food waste introduction is, yes, you're absolutely right in terms of the marketing, Councillor Barnard, because we did a number of stories where we compared the volume and the weight of food waste to, I think it was blue whales and the Eiffel Tower. And that for individuals, then it becomes a bit more real, and they can visualize in their mind what a blue whale might look like and how heavy that might be. So it becomes, rather than just a sort of kilograms of CO2, it becomes real. So thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Really helpful.
I'll follow on from that, because it really is, a picture can say 1,000 words.
Absolutely.
And what we have accomplished in my team is exactly that. We took on a project with 3 weekly, no one expected, and my officers and myself were told it won't happen, people won't do it, and they came on board. We named, and now this is where we get the schools involved, and this is again going back to Gareth, and he will state that I will be going around some of the schools. It's just to enlighten you what's happening at the moment. Because the 8 schools that attended, and the money that we will be progressing through with them on projects, but that will then help, and I'm sure Mary will want to, I did try to get her hold of Mary to let you know about this money, that we encourage our young persons to give us ideas, like with naming the dog. You know, and where they said to me, well, how do we do things? Well, when we put the on the sides of the lot at the trucks, and then naming the trucks, that gives us the opportunity again of making things happen. But the one thing I do want to bring up is idling outside of schools. A young girl came up with that script, and suddenly we had the ability of showing that young people had got it. You don't sit outside the car and have it revving still that's the sort of thing I want to get out there. One thing I wanted to bring up, and this is something, Tony, that we need to, I think, we have a large company called Waitrose.
Yeah, agree.
And I
Agreed.
went and they did a very good talk the other day, and I'm sure we could ask them to come along at looking at the trucks, their lorries, their movements they are going, all their fleets electric. I am sure they will come and speak to us about that. It is something
If you remember, Dorothy, we actually, and I can't remember who the councillor was, but we took it to Tesco's because, and this was over
Waitrose,
Martin Herons, wasn't there? And
Well,
we
Waitrose are
we
prepared
wanted
to help
electric,
us.
and in fact they changed their mind and made them diesel.
Well,
So,
let's go with Waitrose and ask them to come along and speak to us. We are doing so well on the food side. And as you know, the AD is coming. Believe me, that is something I really am going to be pushing for. But last but not least,
yes, I think this is
the solar panels.
This is the point I'm trying to make about the future, because I think the AD is a very important thing, and people can understand that. And the other thing is, Dorothy, is the old tip with the voltamechanic cells that we're going to put on it. I think people need to kind of know that, because it looks like we're really planning for the future.
This is, again, it's once I knew we were succeeding, that's when I've had my offices in my team working. Let's do the next part up. Let's move it.
And that's what I think people want to know, and it gives them confidence. Okay,
yes.
cool. I'm going to move on if that's okay. Ian Lake, it's all yours.
Thank you, Chairman. I was getting a lot of background noise. I'm hoping that has.
I think it's gone, but anyway.
Stop. First of all, can I thank Damien and the presentation that he's given. I thought it was very factual. Before I go any further, Chairman, in my papers that I'm looking at now, there is a strategy report as a separate document.
Yes.
Are we going to discuss that later?
I was confused by this, Damien. At the end of it, there seemed to be a repeat of some of the stuff that was in the strategy, and with a few facts that were different, and I didn't quite know how that fitted in. This is in my report.
Sorry, I'm just looking at the documents. You should have the annual report on progress.
Yeah.
And there's a supplementary appendix which shows the kind of the pictorial version of it.
Right. I don't quite. Okay.
What I'm looking at, Chairman, just for clarity, is I'm looking at the first page of a document which is headed Climate Change Strategy, Annual Report on Progress 21-22. Is that a document that we are going to discuss, or is that a document which is based on the presentation that Damien has just given?
That's what I based my presentation on.
Fine.
So all of the information that was in that presentation is in that report.
Right, because I want to make some comments on that, if you don't mind. But before I do that, can I just make a few observations, some of which will be a bit controversial, I'm afraid. First of all, like a lot of people, in my business, I've worked very closely with the SME sector, and I still do a lot of mentoring for some large national companies. The large national companies are coping reasonably well in the current climate because they have the resources to take part in this type of exercise,
and they are doing what they can in relation to the climate change agenda. I've got great sympathy with the SME sector. John Harrison alluded to it a short while ago, but many of these people are teetering on the brink of survival.
Yeah.
And I think that we need to bear that in mind, because we've got to see them through this period where they can get back on their feet again, reinvigorate their businesses before we try to badger them.
Yeah,
that's probably not the right word, but you know what I mean.
I do.
With climate change issues.
Yeah.
Because they're small businesses, I don't think they need to be told what the issues are. They know what the issues are. What they need is some time to get it together, to get their resources back on train, and work on it. And I've every confidence that they'll do that, because at the end of the day, the SME sector are the future large businesses of tomorrow.
Yeah, no, I think if I may interrupt, Ian, I think that point's been made, because I think Mark will jot some facts down, and I think providing we make a bit more wording to those figures, because people looking at the figures will think that's a poor show, but actually it doesn't tell the picture.
No, right, fine, good. Finally, if I could, not finally, but can I just help Damien Mate on the SIL matter? Because the SIL monies that come into the borough actually go into the general revenue account. And while we have an infrastructure programme on which we can spend that money, that's more, that's there for guidance rather than following. So we shouldn't have any difficulty in setting aside in my view, a set percentage of the SIL income on an annual basis to deal with this sort of thing. And I'd like to think that that's one of the recommendations that this committee could make to the executive.
Yeah.
I want to take Gareth up as well. Well, not take him up, but support him on the point that he's made about residents. And this is leading me back to this draft report. One of the reasons that we have been successful with our residents, not just in food waste, but also bin collection and all sorts of other things, is because we've treated them intelligently, we've consulted with them, and we've operated pilot schemes with them. And we've helped them to understand what the benefit to them is in following these strategies. And I think that's something that we need to bear in mind and follow when we're dealing with this matter. And finally, Chairman, I just want to address this draft report, because there, in my view, there is a difference between that report and the presentation which Damien has given. The first thing is, I believe the forward, you are the chairman of this committee, and the forward on that report should come from you as the chairman. That's standard practice in all the annual reports that all the committees produce, and I think that it ought to be the case here. I'm a little bit unhappy with the introduction that's being given by the director. I think it needs significant rewording in a number of places, because to begin with, he talks about changing the culture at Bracknell Forest. All of us have had this culture, and I think Damien alluded to it, that we started down this track a couple of elections ago, I think 2006, 2007, and we've always had a culture of change and development, and to suggest that the success has been recently changing the culture, I don't believe is giving the right message. And I think that needs significant rewording. And if you wish, I'm prepared to help you to do that. I also think that some parts of it are a little bit condescending, because to suggest that people have to change and give up some of their lifestyles, I don't think is a way to do it. In general, I think there are too many words in it. I think if we use some of the graphics and headline bullet points that Damien has used in his presentation, I think that would be far better, because the purpose of an annual report is to be short, to be punchy, and to get over the significant facts. And again, I'm prepared to assist in that area if necessary. And finally, I agree with you that while we may not be able to do it in complete detail, there needs to be something at the end of the report that points the way ahead, because that is going to be the impetus for next year. And finally, can I say that as an elected member, I regard all the officers in whatever departments they work as on our team. They belong to all of us. They work for all the members of the borough. They don't work for single members of the borough. They work for members of the borough, and they work for our residents. And I'm proud of that. And they belong to all of us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ian, very much indeed. And I think this is a good idea about the fund, and I would recommend, I've written something down which I'd like to stick as a recommendation. The panel would like the executive to consider a proportion of the SIL money to go towards a funding for home insulation.
I'll second that.
Okay, there you go. The other thing, just before I pass this to Dorothy, and I know we should wind this up, what I'd like to do, because I've got some points also, which I know we don't have time to go through. So I'll bung those through to Damien and to Kevin, and then we can have a conversation. I think that's the best way forward, rather than talk at this point. But do you want to just have a last word, Dorothy, before I close the proceedings?
Of course. Our team is a great team. That's why we all work together. Having said that, Damien, I'm sure you'll appreciate it's not a matter of our team, but we are cut up in bits. That's why we have the problem, as you know, Tony. When I put together originally the working party for the food waste, and I'm Councillor Leek was part of that, and Councillor Temperton, and at the end of it being the success we got from it, that's where this committee, well, it's not a committee, it's only an advisory panel. And we've got to remember, if we're going to change it, it has to be done via the whole council.
Yeah, but we can make recommendations.
Having said that,
we can make recommendations.
The recommendations, that is why you come back to the executive, and that was why we do it under process.
Yeah. Not
that you don't like this. No, it's already gone before the PRGs. They've had this. It was before the executive. I think the draft went before executive.
Well, excuse me, Dorothy, but I never saw it, or I was never contacted about any of it, frankly.
No,
and I have to say to you, Dorothy, and I would say this also of Ian, he's quite right. The chairman is the chairman, and the chairman should have some say in it, and that's the end of the matter. But I don't want an argument over this.
Don't have to. We know where they're coming from.
If I may finish, what I would like to say is I want to say thank you very much to Damien for what he's done.
a great team we have.
And his team. And also, I'd like to say that there are, you know, there's always going to be points which people want to bring up and improve. And, you know,
Well, that's why we have this advisory panel. That's what you are, advisory.
That's why we're here. So, look, thank you very much, Damien. I want to end this on a good note and say thank you for all the team and the work. And, you know, let's keep in touch. I know Mark's going to do something. I do think it's really important to do that thing about the, you know, about the businesses, because I don't want us as a borough to look as though we're not, you know, we're not pulling our weight. And I know we're not, but we need to say this firmly. And we also need to do things about planning, because planning is another problem with this government, who hasn't actually done much about it and talked about it, but they haven't done much about it. So look, thank you very much. I'd like to end it now because I think we all need to go and have a drink. And Harry, are you still here?
I am indeed, yes.
I know. Are you going to finish this? I mean, thank you, Harry, for looking after us. The next meeting is on the 29th, which is about hydrogen. And it's a topic that I am very, very, very interested in, because I don't think this government has understood it. And I don't think this government has put enough money into it. So we'll see what we do, and we can make some recommendations and pass those through. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Damien. Excellent.
We're going to talk about hot air, are we?
Yes.
As
we are.
always, I can rely on the team.
Okay. All right. Good night, everyone. Have a nice drink.
Good night, all.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Good night.
Bye, Damien.
Ciao,
Night,
ciao.
everyone.
Good night all.
Bye.